Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, we're reviewing Rudy Gobert's season with the Timberwolves, and I'll get on a bit of a soapbox about why Rudy Gobert did deserve Defensive Player of the Year and why his impact was so much greater in year two in Minnesota than it was in year one. It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use the code, all lowercase, LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend. And lots to get to today. It's the Rudy Gobert season review podcast. And Rudy was a lot better in year two in Minnesota than year one. And there was a lot of too much Rudy slander on a national level in the playoffs. And I try not to get caught up in the narratives, but this is such a dumb one. The whole, and I talked about it a little bit during the playoffs, but the Kendrick Perkins being embarrassed to vote, that he voted for him for Defensive Player of the Year, all that garbage. I feel like that's the right time to address it a bit. So we'll do that today, but also, obviously, as we always do on the show, back up all of it with actual hard numbers, facts, evidence for why Rudy Gobert, or at least, I don't know if evidence is the right word, but numbers to back up why Rudy did win his fourth Defensive Player of the Year award and why he deserved to win his fourth Defensive Player of the Year award. So we'll talk about all that on the show here today. A big thank you here off the top, though, for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and it's available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T Wolves and also at Beecken with two B's, two E's, CKEN. All right. So Rudy Gobert, year one in Minnesota. Of course, everyone knows everything the Wolves gave up to acquire Rudy Gobert. And I get so tired still of this conversation about how they gave up too much. Couple things about that really quickly. That's not what this show is going to be today, but I have to set the stage. I've done that all along with all the player reviews, like how the player was acquired, et cetera. So we know that the Timberwolves gave up Malik Beasley, Patrick Beverley, Leandro Bolmaro, Jared Vanderbilt, Walker Kessler, who had just been drafted, and then essentially 4 future first-round picks. Was it too much? Well, I don't know, because Rudy Gobert has been on the Timberwolves for exactly 2 seasons. They've been better with him than they were without him. There's no question about that. I know that the first Rudy season, they were slightly worse in terms of seeding and everything than they were the year before. But the Karl-Anthony Towns injury certainly threw a wrench in that. Plus Rudy's performance, which was obviously impacted by injury and fatigue out of Eurobasket, et cetera. There are asterisks attached to that first season. Year two is an overwhelming success with the Timberwolves getting the 3rd seed in the West, first for most of the year in the West, 56 wins, go to the conference finals, which is deeper than Rudy had ever gotten with Utah. And deeper than the Timberwolves have been in 20 seasons and tied for the longest they've ever played in their franchise's history. Did they give up too much? I can't answer that. We can maybe answer that question once Rudy Gobert's career in Minnesota is done. And I'm not saying that because of let's wait and see who Utah drafts with those picks the Wolves gave up. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if the Timberwolves win a championship with Rudy Gobert, I'm pretty sure I heard Ryan Russillo say on his podcast or on Simmons' podcast that even if they win a championship, he'll always say it's too much, which is a patently absurd thing to say. And I like Ryan Russillo. I think he does a good job. I generally agree with how he analyzes basketball. However, if you win a championship, I don't care what you gave up. I mean, Toronto got Kawhi Leonard on a rental and won a championship, and then he was just gone. Who cares? They won a championship. That's only one team wins a championship every year. And I don't care what franchise it is. If you're the Lakers, you give up everything to win a championship. That's just how this works. That's the goal. So to say that they gave up too much, even if they win a championship, is a crazy thing to say. Now, where is that line? I mean, if Rudy Gobert suddenly retired tomorrow, would they have given up too much? I don't know. It's still a silly. I mean, yeah, I guess so, because you would have gotten 2 years in a conference finals appearance. But if they go to the conference finals for the next 3 years, maybe they pull a Buffalo Bills, hopefully not, from the early 90s, and they go to the conference finals or the finals and lose. They don't win a title, but they're always in the mix. They're one of the final 4 teams 3 out of 4 years or something like that. Would it be worth it? Probably. You need to get into the tournament. You need to give yourself a real chance and be a championship contender. And sitting here right now, the Minnesota Timberwolves are absolutely a championship contender next season. And they were this season. And no, they didn't win the title, but this is year 2 of the Rudy Gobert era, if you will. So all that to say, I think that context is important because, and I guess the other thing that crowd, I don't think I'm really building a straw man here. I think this is a legitimate criticism, is like, hey, he's not your best player. He may not be your second best player, depending on your feelings on Karl-Anthony Towns. If Ant's your best player, why are you giving up that much for, not a player who's going to be the best player on a championship team? Well, he may not be the best all-around player, but this team does not have the number 1 defense without Rudy Gobert. And if they don't have the number 1 defense, they're not a top 3 seed in the Western Conference. I mean, this was a middle-of-the-pack offense. Depending on where you look, they finished 15th to 17th in offensive rating this season. And teams don't finish as the 3rd seed, 1 game out of the top seed, with a middle-of-the-pack offense unless the defense is truly dominant. And I don't want to turn this into a defensive, unpacking the Wolves' defense for the year. Well, I guess it is partly that, because it's a Rudy Gobert show today, right? And I've said this many times before, this was the biggest gap between the number 1 defensive team and the number 2 defensive team in any given NBA season. The second time in 20 years we've had a gap this big. The only other one was the Spurs in the 2015-16 season that had a difference of over 3 points in defensive rating for the season. And this year's Wolves team was between 2.5 and 3. I forget where it actually finished, but it was the second greatest gap between the top defense and the second ranked defense in the last 20 years. It was literally the best defense in a decade, you could argue a generationally good defense. And I know that what have you done for me lately? Did it matter in the playoffs? Well, it certainly mattered early in the playoffs, and it certainly mattered at times against Denver when they just overwhelmed the Nuggets with their activity and their length defensively. It didn't matter against Dallas because Luka got hot, and he was probably is the perfectly built player to exploit the Wolves. And I was wrong at some point in my analysis saying I thought Dallas wasn't a bad matchup for Minnesota. I underestimated what Luka was going to be able to do with his size and physicality. And also, some of these Dallas three-point shooters suddenly came alive in a way that they hadn't earlier in the playoffs and weren't in the regular season and haven't been so far in the finals. But they did against the Wolves. And I credit Dallas, of course. It was a tough matchup for Rudy Gobert. And all of the above can be true. It can still be a reasonable trade for Rudy Gobert. It can still have made the Wolves a top 3 seed in the West and a top 4 team in the NBA overall this year, a conference finals team, a 56-win team, and still not have worked out well in the conference finals simply because of the matchup. And that is all fair game. It's all possible. What I want to do next is I want to talk about what Rudy did this year that was so dominant and how he changed the Wolves defense. And I think that'll kind of lead into I was already kind of on a soapbox during this segment, but I'll get on a bit of another one later about Rudy's impact and why some of the, I guess, revisionist history or the regret regarding Rudy Defensive Player of the Year votes and stuff like that is so absurd. We'll get to all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is America's #1 fantasy sports app with more than 5 million members. It's the most fun and exciting way to get in on the action while you watch your favorite sports and players. You just pick more or less on 2 or more player stats for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. With Prize Picks, you could turn $10 into $1,000 in a single game watching your favorite sports this summer. You can make a Prize Picks lineup in as little as 60 seconds. You just need to pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and you're locked in. If you're looking for promotions, Prize Picks has got you covered every week. From lowering select player stat projections on Tuesdays, which increases your chances of getting a win, to getting your entry fees back if you have a losing lineup on Fridays. Plus, there's always action on Prize Picks. June is the perfect time to try out something new. As basketball winds down, probably in the next few days here, make sure to try out esports this month, because for every Wednesday and Saturday in June, Saturday, that's tomorrow, if your lineup doesn't win, you'll get your entry fee back. Choose from Counter-Strike 2, Call of Duty, League of Legends, and more. Download the app today. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, download the app today. The code is LOCKEDONNBA. You'll get a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. Do you watch Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day long? If so, no doubt you have to turn down the volume because of all the shouting. Instead, make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right. Rudy Gobert this season, significantly better than year one in Minnesota. And what he did was pretty much in line with what he'd done in his prime years in Utah. He won his first Defensive Player of the Year award since the 2020-21 season, which was his second to last season with the Jazz. He had won 3 in 4 years, dating back to 2017-18. If you want to look at just his raw numbers, he, across the board, was better than his first year in Minnesota. And again, maybe slightly below his prime mid-late 20s years in Utah in terms of field goal percentage, points per game, blocks per game, rebounds per game, all that stuff. But it was all elevated above what he did in year one in Minnesota. And if you start to look at the rate-based stats and some of the advanced stats, it's a lot closer to what he did in Utah than even the raw statistics. In fact, his block rate was only 0.2 points lower than what it was his last year in Utah. Turnover rate was way lower, while the usage rate was also a little bit lower, simply because the Wolves have more offensive weapons. But on the defensive side, the rebound rate was, close to where it had been in Utah. The advanced stats overall, win shares, et cetera, actually defensive win shares, largely due to the rest of the Wolves' defensive piece. I shouldn't say largely, in part due to the rest of the Wolves' defensive pieces. Individual player defensive win shares is not the most accurate way to measure a player's defense. But for what it's worth, it was the second best mark of his career, and the third time in his career he's led the league in individual defensive win shares. Offensively, we saw the free throw rate back up to where it had been a few years ago in Utah, and even while the usage rate was lower, it was partly because the Wolves' other offensive weapons are so dangerous that teams began wrapping up Rudy Gobert far more often, trying to force him to get to the free throw line. He had been shooting his lowest 3-point percentage in 3+ years, but he finished the year on that hot streak that brought him up, in line to where he's been for much of his career. In fact, just a 1/10 of a percentage point below his career free throw percentage. And he continued to shoot the ball better from the line in the playoffs. He was 67%. Again, he's career, 64-ish, 63.9% from the line. So, I certainly not, I wouldn't say better offensively, but not worse. Like he was just as impactful offensively. And Chris Finch always talks about Rudy Gobert's gravity, and offensively and defensively, Gobert's gravity is undeniable. And he's very good at rolling to the rim. He's good at those dives to the rim. He, I think, could be a little better at rim running and transition. Part of the problem there is the Timberwolves haven't always trusted him and his hands in the open floor, and for good reason. I think you shouldn't be hitting him on the run with the bounce pass. And we've seen guys try that. Ant tries that a little too often with Rudy. But if he gets a rim run and can seal right in front of the basket, I think the Wolves could do a better job at hitting him there. If it's a stationary Rudy Gobert, he can catch that ball as long as it's not a bounce pass at his ankles. We saw D'Angelo Russell in year one for Rudy, the first half of Rudy's first year in Minnesota, just refused to pass him the ball. And it led, I don't know, chicken or the egg there, but him and Rudy didn't get along. That was a big piece of it. Again, I don't know which came first, if there wasn't the trust first, or if there was, that became a trust issue between the two of them. And Mike Conley certainly has, worlds better chemistry with Rudy Gobert than D'Angelo Russell did. But the Wolves could do a little bit better job of getting him involved in the secondary break. If he does do that rim run and seal in transition and run the floor, reward him, get him an opportunity for a dunk or a lay-in or a foul. That's the one area I think they could certainly make some progress. Otherwise, I would agree with some of the national talking heads. I shouldn't say talking heads. There's the talking heads, right? The cable TV guys. And then there's the podcast circuit and some of the national analysts who I think, maybe I'm biased because I'm on a podcast right now, but like generally there's a little bit more analysis and thought put into it. And there was some discourse around the Wolves forced the ball to Rudy too much. And I, there were a couple places I heard this. I don't disagree with that. I do think even though his usage rate was lower than it was in Utah, again, that's a function of Ant, Cat, even Jaden, more offensive weapons than what Utah had. It was pretty much Donovan Mitchell. And then, some spot up shooting from, and Mike Conley did a little more early in his Utah career. Before that, it was Ricky Rubio, who wasn't a high usage offensive player. There just wasn't other very early in Rudy's career. You're talking Gordon Hayward years, but like there just wasn't as much offensive punch in Utah. So of course his usage rate is going to be lower. At lowest market had been in what, 8 years for Rudy since the 15-16 season. But I think that's okay. And I still think it was a little too high given the number of weapons the Wolves have. But Finch always talks about the gravity. And a lot of times what Rudy's impact is it's setting the screen, it's rolling, and it's the defense, overplaying that role, hopefully to open up a shooter on the weak side, for a skip past the corner, whatever that might be, or at least send the defense in rotation where they're in recovery mode. And then maybe the ball swings back, or it does get dumped down to Rudy after a couple swings on the perimeter and they're rushing out to contest a corner three. And now Rudy's open in the paint. Those sorts of things are still available for Minnesota. And I think that it's certainly a fine line between over-involving Rudy and picking your spots. And I think the Wolves still are working that through. And that's certainly still a thing that there's room for improvement. I want to get into some of the defensive numbers now on the defensive numbers on the defensive side. Yes. But to kind of underscore just how impactful he is defensively. And there's a lot of different ways we could look at this. There's straight up opponent field goal percentage or closest defender field goal percentage, which is very positive in terms of bigs for Rudy. B-ball index has some good numbers. Percentage of rim shots contested, which is interesting. It is exactly what it sounds like. The percentage of shots at the rim contested by Rudy when he's on the floor. Got an A+ at B-ball index. That's 97th percentile. He contested 51% of rim shots. If you look at rim shots contested per 75 possessions, that's lower. But do you know why that is? It's because of the overall defensive deterrence for shots at the rim. We talked about this several times, especially in those playoff matchups leading into the playoff series, the respective playoff series. The Wolves, in terms of opponent rim frequency, was opponent rim shot frequency or frequency of shot attempts at the rim was very low because of, first of all, the Wolves' first line of defense, their point of attack defense, whether it's Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Jaden McDaniels, Anthony Edwards, the overall perimeter defense, which is all of those guys. And you could add in Kyle Anderson there and at times Mike Conley. And then also the fact that how many never minds would Rudy Gobert get per game in the regular season, especially? Guys just not wanting to challenge Rudy Gobert in the paint. So the actual frequency of rim attempts was down. And so that's going to drive down the rim contest per 75 possessions. But the percentage of actual rim shots that were shot and then contested is 97th percentile for Rudy Gobert. Blocks per 75 possessions is also an A+, 96th percentile, nearly 2.5 blocks per 75 possessions for Rudy Gobert. And then block rate on contests. So in terms of take the overall number of contested shots that he actually blocks, 97th percentile, also an A+, and that's over 41%. So nearly half of the time that Rudy was contesting a shot, he was blocking the shot, which is crazy. The best one is adjusted rim points saved per 75 possessions. So the definition on B-ball index is a measure of points saved on shots at the rim by the defender based off their ability to contest shots, with smaller samples regressed with league and roll average rim defensive field goal percentage values. So again, adjusted rim points saved per 75 possessions, nearly 2 points saved per 75 possessions. That's 99th percentile. So essentially best in the league, probably is best in the league. Grades out as an A+. So he's got 4 A+ on the interior defense, section on B-ball index. Players don't challenge Rudy at the rim, and when they do, they're not successful. And that's a massive credit to Rudy Gobert. And that, to me, that number, that rim points saved per 75 possessions is maybe the biggest thing, because that's a literal tangible thing. Essentially 1.6 points saved per 75 possessions. So over the course of the game, that's 2 points saved simply by deterring people at the rim. And that doesn't factor in any of the other stuff, like the possessions that don't get anywhere near the rim because of Rudy's presence, which again suppresses the overall quantity of shots taken at the rim, frequency of shots taken at the rim by opponents. That is why Rudy Gobert is the defensive player of the year. And you can add in all the other stuff we already talked about. The league best defensive win shares individually, the one of the best defensive rebounders in the league 2 years ago in Utah. He was the league's best defensive rebounder by rate and rebounds per game. The stuff that doesn't show up in any of these stats. And that's also like, it's easy to talk about the stuff that doesn't show up in the box score that players do, but that's what a lot of these advanced metrics attempt to measure, is exactly that. A traditional box score is not going to show you these adjusted points at the rim. And that matters. It's not simply like a made-up stat to make Rudy Gobert look better. This is exactly what front offices do. There's a reason why Gobert was valued, or is valued in this way, and why he continues to win Defensive Player of the Year. Because it's more than simply opponent points per game or opponent points in the paint or, Luka scoring 35 in a playoff game. There's so much more that builds into this. And yes, there were playoff struggles, and I'll address that here a little bit in a second. But the body of work for Rudy Gobert was awesome this year. And it was very much in line with what he did in his prime in Utah. And, going into his age 32 season, is there some regression in the future due to, mileage, et cetera? He played the most games he's played in a season since 2018-19 this year, which is a testament to both Rudy and the Wolves coaching staff. And we said the same thing about Mike Conley a couple shows ago. So yeah, there's a little concern there about tread on the tires, but Rudy should age well in terms of his defensive impact. It's some of the on an island on the perimeter stuff that he got stuck doing in the playoffs that could diminish a bit in the next couple of years. But everything else in terms of his defensive impact, I think, should remain about the same. All right, let's talk about some of the discourse surrounding his playoff performance. That's how we'll close the show here today. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at LinkedIn. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. LinkedIn has a vast network of more than 1 billion, with a billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. It gives you access to professionals you can't find anywhere else. LinkedIn does all that while making the process easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing a ton of hats and might not have the time or resources to hire. They're constantly finding ways to make the process easier. They even just launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process even easier and quicker. 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, Rudy Gobert in the playoffs. It wasn't as pretty as it was in the regular season. There's no denying that. It was still good. It was still impactful. The Timberwolves were far better with Rudy Gobert on the floor than they were with him off the floor for the body of work in the playoffs. There's no denying that. They were simply better with him on the court than they were off the court. In fact, the plus minus net per 100 possessions, I'm just looking at the basketball reference number. We could pull the clean in the glass. It'd be similar. They just filter out garbage time, which actually, well, I don't know. That actually, well, I'm not sure, actually. I should have pulled the clean in the glass number. But on basketball reference, it's not going to be all that different. It's a plus 16, the on-off. A plus 16 with Rudy on the court versus off the court. And his overall on-court plus minus per 100 possessions was a plus 9.9, which, if you want to look at the narrative from the last couple of years, well, his net on-off was certainly better each of the last 5 seasons he played in the playoffs, the last 3 years in Utah and these 2 years in Minnesota. And last year, by the way, even though it was only 5 games, a plus 13.7. The on-court plus minus per 100 possessions was negative the last 2 years for Rudy, but it was a plus 9.9 this year, a career best. Rudy Gobert was still good in the playoffs. The challenge in the Dallas matchup, as we've talked about, was that what Rudy's best at, drop coverage, is what Luka's best at exploiting, because he's the only player in the league that has the ability to score in all the different ways he does, and also has the passing touch, both on lobs and passes to the corner. Jokic is close, but he's obviously less explosive off the dribble facing up than Luka Doncic is. Not that I would ever use the word explosive to define or to describe Luka, but explosive is not the right word. What word am I looking for? Less potent, maybe? Yeah, let's say that. Yeah, Jokic can make mid-range jumpers and he can, operate in the mid-post and shoot from there and score from there, but he's far more comfortable in the low post or facing up on the perimeter as essentially a point guard, whereas Luka can do all of the above and make the passes. Now, I'm not arguing that Luka's better than Jokic. I'm not making that argument at all. I think that Luka's bad games are worse than Jokic's bad games. That to me is the biggest difference. That's a whole other conversation, but the good games for Luka are every bit as good as the good games for Jokic because he can be so potent as a scorer and then he can still facilitate. And he's so good if you watch back what Dallas did to Minnesota, he's reading the Timberwolves dunker spot defenders, basically, right? The guys who guarding the players in the corner. And if they start to sink too far, he kicks it to the corner for a three. If they stay home, then he's driving into the paint and maybe he's hitting a cutter from the other corner. Or kicking it back out to the slot for an open three-pointer. Just that in-between game, the way that he picks apart a defense and the best defense in the league, mind you, is just incredible. Now, Boston, compared to Minnesota, not to get too much into the finals conversation, they've just been more active, which is super frustrating because Minnesota obviously is the personnel and had the track record of the regular season of the activity level, the length, the athleticism, bothering opponents. That kind of went away. I shouldn't say it went away. It wasn't as strong or consistent against Dallas. Fatigue played into it. Luka's brilliance played into it. Getting down on themselves after losing some games they should have won certainly played into it. And those are all mental barriers they have to get past if they're going to win a championship, of course, right? But they're all very real. We can still acknowledge that it happened. And it was a combination of Luka's brilliance and the Timberwolves failing defensively. And Rudy was part of that. I think early in the series, he was dropping too far. As the series went on, I think the Wolves improved that. Certainly in games, we'll call it 3 and 4, and the second part of game 2, I think, where he was kind of dropping, but still within an arm's length, which is kind of, you have to do both. You have to play in between. And Rudy's still quick enough to do that. He's long enough to do it. He's one of the few guys. And it's how the Wolves essentially defended the Jokic to Aaron Gordon lob so well over the course of that Denver series. For the most part, better than any other team has really defended it. There's very few guys that can do that. Maybe Bam Adebayo, probably Victor Wembanyama, as long as he understands the coverage, that the length, the athleticism, he can do that. There are not many players that can do that. And Rudy can do both, or he can play both. He can do that, play that role. But Luka is so brilliant that it didn't matter. And he got hot, and the Wolves, Jaden got into foul trouble, and Kyle Anderson was a little slow to guard him, although I thought he did the best job against Luka. And at times was in foul trouble, and they tried to, he was exhausted after guarding Kyrie. And I'm not making excuses. I'm talking about what happened in this series. And I don't think this was on Rudy. Because Dallas had a relative, certainly compared to Phoenix, and even compared to Denver, they had more depth/size. They had more guys that could provide size with length and athleticism, whether it's Derek Lively or Daniel Gafford, and eventually Maxi Kleber. Like, they just had more options to throw at the Wolves, and their bigs outplayed Minnesota's bigs in that series, and Rudy was part of that. I don't think it's an indictment on Rudy Gobert. It's the brilliance of Luka and the roster building, which at the beginning of the year, I laughed at Dallas's roster building. I talked on the show about how I didn't think they'd had any shot at being a top 4 team in the West and they weren't in the regular season, but because of the way they built their roster. But they flipped everything at the deadline, and in the PJ Washington acquisition and the Gafford acquisition, obviously they rebuilt themselves on the fly in a crazy way. So credit to them. They outplayed Minnesota's bigs, and that includes Rudy. Again, the overall playoff numbers were very impressive for Rudy Gobert. So it's not an indictment on Rudy as a player or on his play in the playoffs. And my mini soapbox on the national discourse, I go back to segment 1. I hit a lot of it there. But what he's done in the playoffs and what the Timberwolves did over the course of the season and Rudy's impact on the league's best defense doesn't go anywhere. They're not this defense without Rudy Gobert. They're not a 56-win team without Rudy Gobert. They're not in the conference finals without Rudy Gobert. I mean, just last season, this team won 42 games and was 10th in defensive rating, which is still fine. The year before that, they were 13th in defensive rating with a really high variance scrambling defense. The year before that, which was the year when Chris Finch was hired midseason, they were 28th in defensive rating. So Finch takes them from 28th to 13th by playing up, using the personnel of Jared Vanderbilt and Patrick Beverley. And you credit Chris Finch, you credit Elston Turner and the coaching staff. And then you get into the 22-23 season and acquire Rudy, And the defense improves slightly again. And then this year, the team jumps from 42 wins to 56 wins, and you have to credit Rudy Gobert as the biggest reason for that. Jaden's improvement, certainly. Ant's improvement defensively, yes. And the coaching staff, yes. But this was Rudy Gobert being healthy, being in shape, being ready to go, having a great year. And he absolutely deserves that Defensive Player of the Year award. Moving forward, I mean, Rudy's under contract for the next couple of years. He is extension eligible, which is a topic we'll revisit this offseason. It's certainly possible he's asking the Wolves for this extension. He only has one more year and then a player option for 25-26. He's not going to opt out of $46.5 million in 2 years at age, whatever, 34 he'll be then. So the Wolves either extend him now or, perhaps he is unhappy over the next couple of years over the contract situation, and then he leaves after the 26th season and you lose him for nothing. And I don't know. There's a lot of different ways this thing could go, but he is extension eligible. Next year, if he copies and pastes this season to next year, everybody would take that. This team takes the next step from the conference finals to the finals because of this experience, an increase in mental toughness, an increase in hopefully conditioning, some tweaks around the fringes of the rotation, possibly having to replace Kyle Anderson. But they need the same thing from Rudy Gobert next year. If they get the same thing, they're going to be right back in this spot with a real chance to win a championship as a legit NBA Finals contender. If they get the same thing in 24-25 as they got this year, the Wolves would take that. All right. That's all we have for you today. Next week, we'll get into player reviews for Karl-Anthony Towns and Anthony Edwards. And then by midweek next week, we'll be talking NBA draft. We'll be just a week away from the NBA draft. So lots upcoming here next week on the show. Big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and, of course, at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.